attackers, like those who come and try to, hack us, hunt us, breach us, whatever, they understand like open source is something that really works today. Like, hey, people use open source. That's like a good viable way of getting in. And so, as is with a lot of open source ecosystems like PyPI, like Ruby Gems, like NPM, it's pretty easy to just build something and put it out there, and like if people use it, then that's lovely, until that thing is actually malicious.
Welcome to the DevSec for Scale podcast, the show that makes security a first-class citizen for growing companies. My name is Jeremy Hest, Head of Developer Relations at Achilles, the secrets management SaaS platform. This interview podcast brings security experts and practitioners together to offer practical and actionable ways for small and growing companies to implement security best practices using shift-left principles without interrupting developer life cycles. Welcome back, everyone, to the DevSec for Scale podcast. I'm Jeremy Hess from Achilles, and with me today is a good friend, Liran Tal. He is the Director of Developer Advocacy at Snyk. He is also a web security activist and an open source software champion. Liran, it's awesome to have you on today. Thanks so much. I know that you are a little bit under the weather after getting back from KubeCon, and that must have been an amazing trip. And we might be hearing some noise in the background from some renovations happening, but we will get through it. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you, and I appreciate that you giving us the time and being open to push through this.
Definitely. Thank you for having me, Jeremy. It's always a pleasure and fun to chat about these topics with you.
Great. Fantastic. Okay. So we're talking today about open source security, and getting right into things before we talk a little bit about you and Snyk and all of that. What are some of the arguments that you see and hear for using open source security tools over the closed source enterprise type of tools?
Yeah, so I think generally it's more like the free kind of like tools that make it that has been the most adopted recently that we've seen. And whether it's open source or free, just like it's helpful, because I think the shift that's been going on is, where in the past enterprise security has been selling to enterprise the security persona, the AppSec or the CISOs and stuff like that, which still is the case today. We don't have to be totally naive here. I mean, that's kind of like part of it. But I think a lot of what has been, if I would call it the tectonic changes, right, under the ground, has been essentially the fact that developers drive a lot of what the tech is, right? Like they want the bleeding edge. They kind of like do their own like fun and games and experimentation with stuff. And so I think when you make tools for developers, and it helps when it's open source as well, it doesn't have to be, but I think it helps, then it's easy for them to adopt them. Like there's no sales cycle, right? They don't need to go to like an official demo to a website, whatever. They just do self-serve with the tool, which is why I said, like, I think it's either free or open source, but it's helpful. And then they could really just, test it and start using it. And so I think kind of like this is what has been a driving force recently a lot, with just security tools being more catered for developers. That's kind of like where I see the shift going.
Not to mention communities, right?
Yeah, everything communities related is always catering for developers too as well. But agree.
Fantastic. So now that we got that one out of the way, why don't you give us, Liran, a little bit about yourself and what you do for fun and what you do for your work?
Cool. Sometimes they're the same.
That's great.
Most of the time they are. Yeah, so I've joined Snyk about 3.5 years ago as a developer advocate, like the second person on the team, just building this out along with Simon Maple, who's a Java champion and like a really great person who has like started heading the whole DevRel thing at Snyk. So before that, I was actually a developer, right? I was a team lead. We were doing a lot of day-to-day, whatever engineering managers were doing, code reviewing, architecting, all of those kind of stuff. But I was also part of some communities relating to Node.js and security. So I was very actively working on the Node Foundation back then. Today it's the OpenJS Foundation. Everything kind of like bubbled up to that umbrella. So I was part of like the security working group, which is triaging a lot of vulnerabilities, looking at a lot of things. I actually, prior to that, I was even writing a book about node security called Node Security Essentials, or was it Node Essentials? I don't know, but it was something like that. It was fun writing, and it was out of necessity because at a prior employer, we're actually building Node apps back then at like 2014 or so, which was fairly early. It was early adopted by like PayPal, and so at that point as well. But it was still fairly early for like the industry. And so we were, moving out of this like, PHP, Python, some other kind of like tech stacks into this. And it happened because the book happened because essentially the security team at that, big other corporate didn't know about like best practices of Node applications. Like, how do you secure a Node app? What does it even mean? Like, what are the pitfalls? So I had to like do a lot of my own research and learning. And so, came the book, so came, more participation in the community. Open source I've done since like forever, since like I was like a kid, installing Linux, being part of communities. And back then it was, part of mailing lists and stuff like that. And so I think with Snyk, a lot of this, kind of like getting back to your question about what I do for fun. So this is kind of like my fun. And then like this was like, hey, do you want to do this fun stuff as like a full-time job, working with the community, enabling developers to, build secure code and stuff like that. And I was like, this sounds interesting. Let's talk more about it. And so that's kind of like what I do. And happy to chat more about like how does actually, relate to like different activities day to day too. But I also have fun, watching football games or playing them. We actually have a Snyk football team. That's soccer for everyone from from the US listening in. So that's our football. We do that. I enjoy taking hikes and just doing my my own sports and healthy stuff. That's fun. And on the weekend, I can like hack on some projects. And actually, last month before my last travel, now with KubeCon, since you mentioned that, because that's been like almost a 3 weeks travel away from home. But prior to that, I was actually spending the weekend time to do some security research and find command injection vulnerabilities in some open source libraries. So kind of like did that kind of like an unofficial to what we do at Snyk, because like that's not exactly my job, that's other people's job at Snyk. It was fun, and we had some like nice findings and really cool vulnerabilities coming out of this. So yeah, that's me, and that's my fun.
That's awesome. And that also would follow into the next question that I have for you, which is, what is your favorite thing about open source, more related to security? I mean, because we obviously know community is fantastic, but in terms of the security side of things.
Yeah. So I'd go with things that are very kind of like secure coding practices. I like that area of open source security, just because, as developers, like, I've went through a degree thing, some other people probably have, and they don't teach you at like formal computer science or other studies, like, here is how you write secure code to avoid user input, to avoid this and that. They don't do that, which is, I'm not gonna say it's bad that they don't do it, because it's like a bunch of stuff to learn. And so developers go out in the world, they start writing code, they learn the most obvious things about software development, like, cross-cutting concerns, like, testing and making it performant sometimes and so on. But, security is kind of like, the things that gets, shifted behind. So I think there's like a lot to do, teach, educate, like spend time, even like thinking about what are the most like, best practices that we can teach people around security. And so I love that area of like open source security. And my other one is definitely around the supply chain. So it's something that I've been working on, it, like I said, since I've kind of like stepped into the Node.js Foundation and started doing like playing a different role in that sense, because it was I was the person who was managing the whole HackerOne program. So I was getting the reports in, triaging them, looking at them, contacting the maintainers, coordinating the fix, all of that. So that also lent me a lot of purview into what does it mean like when a new library or like a vendor has an open source vulnerability, has a vulnerability in general, doesn't have to be open source.
Right.
How does that actually like go? Like what happens there? What's the process like? What are the, what are the common things that we see happening sometimes? So that really grew into what we have today called, more, I think it's somewhat an abused term. Like, do you remember where the time when DevSecOps was very kind of like buzzworthy? Remember those days?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so these days, supply chain security is the new buzzword. I think it's like a super important topic. I can't tell you how important it is, how much it is important. I think there's like the OpenSSF is like a great testament of that. That's like a foundation. Snyk is there, Google is there, Microsoft is there. It's like a bunch of GitHub and others are there, and like working to really secure the open source of supply chain. But I'm saying it's an abused term, which I don't like it being abused, because a lot of companies just say, we do software supply chain security, but they do something else, which is not related to that really, or like adjacently related, not directly. So I like that area.
That's great. Well, we have it brings me right into the next question that I have actually, which is interesting because that wasn't planned, but talking about software supply chain management, of course, and I have a previous episode on that. And we actually had a Twitter back and forth, you and Barak, about the whole SBOM thing and all that. True. But not getting into that conversation right now. But of course, NPM, we know lately was in the news a bit for having some infected open source packages and all that. And, of course, Log4j as well has been in the news, before that. So what do you think security conscious, developers, engineers should do when they're dealing with open source packages and, should be thinking about security?
Yeah, so that is where I think software supply chain is a bit different than what essentially SBOM and SCA is. It's a related, obviously it's like an adjacent area of domain of some stuff in between, but SCA, a software composition analysis. So knowing all the dependencies that you have. So of course, if someone shouts, hey, there's like a remote code execution with this Log4j library in Java app. So if you're using it, you should upgrade or whatever, then that's kind of like where SCA and SBOM goes in, right? Like SCA essentially says, here are all your dependencies, kind of like I'm scanning them all the time. I'll tell you if there's like a new vulnerability for them, which it gets you covered. SBOM is more of like it's more of the formal specification. So it's like more of like the implementation detail of what maybe an SCA tool could, give you and so on. But also not only, right? Like unrelated to SCA, like the SBOM, the software bill of material is actually giving you kind of like a list of like, this is, I'm building this, I don't know, IP telephony thing, that I'm like the vendor of this, and these are all of the components that make it up. And so I think to developers, it's like very, very important to know what you're running, right? Like if I'm an application builder and I build my app and it's composed of tens or maybe hundreds of dependencies, I probably want to know what I'm running, not so that not to have it at least as like a grocery list, or like, hey, I should know them by heart or whatever. That's not the point. The point is knowing so that if something happens tomorrow, like a vulnerability in one of them, then I know that I'm impacted by it, or I know that I'm not. So I want to have that and have that constantly something that gets, monitored, and that I'm tracking it and so on, rather than proactively, which is what happened, for a lot of organizations that weren't ready for this. Everyone shouted Log4j or the Log4Shell vulnerability, as it's kind of like abbreviated. And people, at that time, they understood the impact, and like there was whole, around it, and it got people to panic. And so they were then kind of like waking up and saying, hey, you know what, let's see what we're running, and then finding hundreds of instances of apps, whatever, deployed with this, and you need to mitigate and all of those kind of things. Well, maybe we'll get to like the NPM or the JavaScript side of it in a second. But I think, for example, how does that relate to like software supply chain is, I've actually been talking about this at my CNCF SecurityCon, which was co-located with KubeCon last week. And my talk was really about kind of like the ending notes, where like SBOM is good, it's important, etc. Everyone are saying it, and that's fine. But let's also think about SBOH, which is software bill of health, right? Like think about the health of the package. It's not just the fact that that it's vulnerable or might be vulnerable tomorrow, but maybe it's going to be deprecated. Maybe there's not a community around it. Maybe it's not maintained anymore, and there will be a vulnerability at that point. Like also fixing it is not as simple as just upgrading it. Have to do the whole API changes because you might need like a different one and so on. Have to like replace it with like the health of a package, like how healthy it is also like part of the signals that using open source is like really, really important, which is why I kind of like think about those kind of areas when I think about, software supply chain security, along with things, they kind of like mean, the whole attestations and the provenance saying essentially like, who signed it, did they sign it, where it was built, where did it came from, and so on. So we can say like also this kind of like relates like the malicious part of it, which brings us into NPM. And did you pick it up just like just to troll me because I'm like a JavaScript person?
No. It's I'm not trying to cheat on this one. I'm just asking you because I know that you're involved in it, but still, yeah. It's interesting to hear from your side, someone who really deals with it on a regular basis.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. I may troll some other ecosystems too, but just for fun and love. That's it. We are all in this together. So I think with NPM, it's easy to get on the news just because like JavaScript is really everywhere. Like it's literally powering websites, right? Which is what drives the web, essentially, like where you go to Twitter or whatever, that's like web. So it's hard. It's hard to like think of NPM as like being a bubble where this stuff happened, because it's not. If you think about it, then like you're missing the whole picture, because there's been like malicious incidents on Ruby gems. There's been like account takeovers. So like one of the things that we've seen are anything from maintainer accounts of like really popular dependencies getting hijacked on both NPM and Ruby gems as well. We've seen typo squatting and malicious packages being even bulkily added, like published at one time, like 3,000 of them. So like, I think it was the Python ecosystem, PyPI. So like it's everywhere really, because people take advantage, like adversarial attackers, like those who come and try to, hack us, hunt us, breach us, whatever. They understand like open source is something that really works today. Like, hey, people use open source. That's like a good viable way of getting in. And so as is with a lot of open source ecosystems, like PyPI, like Ruby gems, like NPM, it's pretty easy to just, build something and put it out there. And like, if people use it, then, that's lovely, until that thing is actually malicious. And so those stories are really happening throughout every ecosystem, some more, some less. I think it depends where researchers want to like spend more of their time. We'll also say that beyond the typo squatting stuff, the malicious packages, the maintainer hijacking, all the stuff that we've seen so far, that's been kind of like at the top of everyone's kind of like news feed, etc. We've also seen some other cases of recently I think about two case studies that's really interesting. One of them, there was an academic research paper about the security of NPM, and I don't remember if it mentioned some other ecosystem, but I do remember it as NPM was one of them. And that is the fact that you, Jeremy, for example, might create a package, and you might be signing up to NPM with your own, jeremy@jeremy.com, domain address. And so what happens if like 10 years after you decided you're going to ditch that, domain, it costs you too much to renew. You probably have like a million domains like everyone else. And that domain expired, but it's still registered as like the owner of a specific package, which might be really, really popular at this point. So what they've actually looked at is they could buy the domain that's now free, but is used as your identity on something like NPM, and just do a reset password kind of process, get access to your package, even though like you have supposedly own it, but something was missing there, the whole domain thing. And that's like a really, that's like a novel way of getting in. Like this is like a classic supply chain security story. And that's kind of like where software supply chain security around open source ecosystems these are really the juicy stuff that we're looking at. It's a lot of stories around like Trojan source was like a really interesting attack into like the invisible characters that might be lurking in your code and you're not seeing them because, your IDE is not showing you control characters and Unicode control characters and stuff like that. So like super interesting. Dependency confusion is something that's not only real, but had actually, we're seeing dependency confusion attacks on ecosystems, specifically NPM from what I'm monitoring, but I'm pretty sure others as well. And, Alex Burchan and his team of, people who like found it, I think they were like awarded the highest bug bounty award for one of the programs. It's like a 40K for finding this. And like they did really infiltrate, areas like AWS, I don't know, Amazon and Microsoft and some others. So like it showed you how like this is like a super realistic thing that happens. And it affected several ecosystems, by the way, like .NET and then some others as well. So like it's all around us and it's like different adversarial threats that we should be more aware of. And it's also like it's growing, like people find more new ways of basically impacting us. So that's kind of like the place where we're now. So I think for developers, at the very least, like being aware of those things, like having that mindset of like, hey, let's like, think twice or three times before we do, an NPM install or something else. So having that mindset, like being very security aware is like super important these days.
Yeah, go ahead and copy and paste your code into like a Word document or something and see what shows up.
Honestly, not sure if that works, but you could try.
It's amazing how innovative you can be when you're talking about what's going on and what vulnerabilities there are in code that people just haven't even thought of yet. So talking about continuing almost on the idea of vulnerabilities and security issues, do you have any embarrassing or even not embarrassing security stories that you could tell us that happened to you personally?
Yeah, definitely, of course. I talk a lot about security best practices, etc. But I also remembered when I was a developer. It's a bit weird to say, but like from like 2 decades, not 2 decades, but like a decade or so ago. So I transitioned from so kind of like my basic experience back then has been I've been building stuff back in like QBasic and then VB and whatever all in all. But my going into the industry here in Israel was mostly around kind of like the system administrator, so what you call DevOps today, or I don't know, SRE maybe. But I was like doing that. I was like very kind of like, low-level Linux administration, like network stuff, daemons and stuff like this, setting things up, configuration, all of those kind of things. And after that, I transitioned to another company to build IP telephony, kind of like a voice over IP kind of like equipment. So like, again, like still very low level kind of stuff. And I think it was my first and only episode doing C++ for like 8 months, which was like a bit crazy. I kind of like learned that by like my team leader was like, hey, grab it. I was like, I don't know C++. I was like, sure, here's a book, have fun with it. And, go ahead and write this thing. I was like, okay, if you're telling me I can do that, I'll do that. So I did. But after a few years there, I actually transitioned into the web kind of thing. So like that's like a very 180 degrees kind of like from like very low level stuff, Linux, very hardcore things to what's web programming and stuff like that. So around 2007, which was in and between that period, I was building this project called Radius, which is kind of like a Wi-Fi. It's for those knowing the Radius protocol, it's basically kind of like a way to like do authorization, authentication, and accounting. It's kind of like when you dial up to your ISP. If you remember, like back then, like dialing up like a username, password, the modem goes do 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 do. Yeah. So AOL. Exactly. There you go, AOL or some other stuff. But maybe you'd hack some accounts to get more time. But I won't go into this. This is beyond the scope of what we're allowed to say here. So the whole infrastructure that drives that, like the whole PPP protocol, L2TP, all this kind of like protocol behind the scenes that talk to like a Radius server, which then has your username, your password, everything. So I've kind of like built the web management platform that kind of like is on top of all of this. There was like a lot of MySQL, a lot of PHP. And the worst thing it was, there were like a lot of PHP and MySQL like this. So like that spaghetti code where everything is like in one file, and you concatenate like user input from the GET request and push that into like a SQL query and stuff like that. This is what I did. And to this day, I probably have a dozen, if not more, vulnerabilities, I guess, onto my name, onto like the Radius software that, by the way, exists until today. People still use that. That's like, these are vulnerabilities. So like, I was like going, hey, when I was a pretty young developer, in my early ages, I wanted to like build features, build fast, do that, new thing that people asked me from the community, because by the way, this is all open source. So like everyone had used it. And I did not think about security. This was like not something that I was like, very aware of. And so like, a decade later, people are starting to open up like, oh, like, hey, you have an SQL injection here in this code and in this code. And up until today, honestly, I'm getting like Hunter reports of people saying that I have to like approve them and go through them and like, do responsible disclosure process and all of this. So yeah, I've myself had written, probably will still write insecure code in the future, but it's more about having the awareness of like, hey, like when you write the next kind of line of code, like what could go wrong? Is that user input? Where is it coming from? So that's kind of like where like I like the shift of mindset going.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for the story. We always it's always good to hear that we're not alone. And the last question that I'd like to ask, which I ask all my guests, is give us 1 or 2 tips for improving developer security without disrupting developer life cycles.
I'll say, so 2 of them. One is prioritize, like, I don't know, use a tool or whatever, met process or whatever you have, but like, prioritize for, the things that are more important for you. Like, one of the things that developers have a lot of struggles with is the frustration of like having too much noise of something. So use the tool, use processes, use whatever kind of like method that works for you to just prioritize and be focused on security for the things that kind of like move the needle, what actually solves things for you. The other one is like use tools that help you, like, not, go to like different dashboards and different systems, like, use a CLI tool, use a Git integration one, use an extension for security in your IDE so you can find things, while you write the line of code, you actually find, this insecure code. So that is surely to be something that gets adopted by developers because it's just helpful to them. Like they don't want more processes, tools beyond what they're used to. They're used to like developing my IDE. Maybe I use the CLI, push it to GitHub. That's how I work. The more you help them augment that with security tools, the more they'll, embrace you.
Awesome. Liran, thank you so much for your time. And I appreciate you doing this under the weather as well. All good, and I had a great time. I learned a lot, as I always do. And I look forward to the next time we get together. And for now, have a really good one.
Thank you. You too. Bye, Jeremy. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.